And then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. I think that it is very important, and I want us just to pull over to a verse that talks about this waiting just a little bit. And it's over in Isaiah chapter 64. I think it's an important verse for all of our lives as Christians and in our walk with the Lord. And what Joseph is going to learn in the length of this trial is basically this: that while we are waiting, God is working. And I tend to think of waiting as the biggest waste of time. I'm a doer. I'm a mover. I want something to happen, even if it's wrong. And then I want to give it to one of the assistant pastors. But I mean, I want to. That's the tendency. Let's do. I hate to wait. Just hate to wait. My flesh just hates it. And so we go to the Scriptures and we learn that while we're waiting, waiting is not a waste of time. God is working while we're waiting. That makes it much easier to wait. And so in Isaiah chapter 64, in verse 4, it tells us, "For since the beginning of the world men have not heard, nor perceived by the ear, nor has the eye seen any God besides you, who acts for the one who waits for Him." Maybe some of you need to hear that tonight while you're waiting. The difficulty of waiting. Oh, it's a waste of time. Nothing is happening. You have no idea what. Besides you, who acts for the one who waits for Him. Maybe some of you need to hear that tonight while you're waiting. The difficulty of waiting. Oh, it's a waste of time. Nothing is happening. You have no idea what's happening. You have no idea what He's doing. The Lord is working the entire time. And so here comes this dream that Pharaoh gets. And he stood by the river. And suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat. Oh, they're ready to be slaughtered. And they fed on the meadow. And then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, speaking of the Nile, ugly and gaunt. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. And so Pharaoh awoke. That's weird, carnivorous cows. That'd be a weird thing to see, wouldn't it? Wake right up. He woke up. And he slept and he dreamed the second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. And behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump heads and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. So we've got carnivorous grain. It was a very weird dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all of the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Why? Because these dreams didn't have their origin in evil. They had their origin in God. God had His man for interpreting these dreams. And then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh and said, "I remember my faults this day." Could have had a V8. He did, And when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each dreamed a dream in one night. He and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream, and it came to pass just as he interpreted for us. So it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. And then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. Pharaoh knows that these dreams are weird. He knows there's something supernatural about them. They brought him out of the dungeon, and they weren't going to bring him all stinky and everything. And so he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, and I mean, you can imagine now the pomp and majesty of this throne room. The grandeur of ancient Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. And so Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. Pharaoh, first things first. And this is character in Joseph's life. You imagine? He's just been brought out of the prison. This is his big chance. This is like the big spin. I mean, everything's riding on this. And the first thing that comes out of Pharaoh's mouth is something wrong that he has to correct. Oh! And yet he can't take the glory from God, and he can't have this man thinking that it's him that is able to do these things, and so he just takes and Lord, and he says what's right in the middle of a very hard situation, a very intimidating situation. This is let the chips fall where they may. Sorry about that illustration. Some of you, Nevada. He said, God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. We can either I'm going to receive glory or God's going to receive glory. We can't both receive glory. And Joseph is very concerned for the glory of God. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. And suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. And then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. Such ugliness as I've never seen in all the land of Egypt. This was tough. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. And when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them. They didn't become fat cows themselves. For they were just as ugly as at the beginning. And so I awoke. He has a way with words. And also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could answer it to me. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. And this is the thing which God has spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all of the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. And so the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God. God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Now, you can kind of think like Joseph is setting himself up for a position here, but he's not. He's continuing now to speak for the Lord. This is what you would call a word of wisdom. God has revealed something supernaturally in the interpretation of the dream. Here's the information. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. There's going to be 7 years of famine. Okay, you've told us that, God. Now what do we do about it? Now we need a word of wisdom from God. And so God begins to speak to Pharaoh a word of wisdom. You need to select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Pharaoh, tax them heavy during those 7 years. I mean, go all the way up to 20%. An idea. And let them gather all of the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as reserved for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. And so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" And I'm personally convinced that Joseph is just telling him what he needs to do, and Joseph is just hoping that he'll get set free. I don't think he understands what's about to happen to him right here. My personal opinion. He just thinks they're going to let me out of prison. I got it right. God, thank you for using me. I'm going to head back and see those brothers of mine. And so here, Pharaoh knows exactly who he needs. This man, and what is it about this man? In whom is the Spirit of God. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word." Now you got to put yourself in his place. He's hearing these words. In 1 hour, he is lifted from an Egyptian prison, a dirty, stinky Egyptian prison. And in 1 hour, he becomes the second most powerful man in the world. God's too much. He's too much. And they're going to be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater to you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all of the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took his signet ring, a symbol of authority, off of his hand, and he put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, "Bow the knee," and so he set him over all of the land of Egypt. That's incredible, just incredible. And all of a sudden it begins to dawn on Joseph, perhaps, why it is that he was so long in the preparation. What it was that God had in mind, exceeding abundantly above all he could have asked or thought. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Total control. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name that, and he gave him as wife this person, the daughter of this guy who was a priest, of On, and I probably mispronounced that. And so Joseph went out over all of the land of Egypt. And so Joseph now begins to understand that the treasure, the real treasure of what was happening all of that time was to be found in the pit. It was to be found in the prison. Was to be found in that difficult family situation, was to be found in that place of oppression. And he realizes now that he takes and moves into this position from the prison. He's a pauper. He has no money. He has no clothes. He has nothing that someone would look and say, now there's a rich man. There's a wealthy man. There's a man who has treasure. And yet he has been for years taking treasure by the handful in the form of character into his life through what God took him through. Character is the